Get your football scores in a snap with the Apple Sports app. The free app for iPhone gives you access to real-time football scores, a dynamic drive tracker, and live play-by-play, all delivered ultra-fast. Plus, get team and player stats, standings, live betting odds, and more. Designed for speed and simplicity, the Apple Sports app is personalized and puts your favorite leagues, conferences, and teams front and center. Download Apple Sports now in the App Store in the US, Canada, and the UK.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and it's official. Daniel Ricciardo is out, and Liam Lawson is in at RB for the rest of the season. But what does this mean for both their F1 futures, and could there be yet more changes to come with 2025 fast approaching? I'm Edd Straw, and joining us to tackle the news are Scott Mitchell-Malm and Ben Anderson. Well, Scott, another one of those days. We knew this news was coming, but you don't necessarily know exactly when, so it's been a bit of a scramble as always, hasn't it? You love that.
Yeah, it's fun as far as the job goes. It's not a super fun story. Like I think we've all kind of had different experiences of Ricciardo in F1 performance wise, but we've all, I think, had the same broadly positive experience with him as a person and the driver. And like his time's up in F1, both in terms of he is actually out of a drive now, but also ability-wise, performance-wise, he's not at the level that he's been at in the past. He hasn't recaptured his peak. So it's not like a move, I think, that you can fundamentally question in terms of was he heading that way anyway? The timing of it, the way it's been handled, the fact that you lose him as a presence in the paddock, all of that is a bit of a shame as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I think we'd all agree with that. And I imagine you would as well, Ben. And let's pile into it, because this has been handled slightly curiously, I think it's fair to say. Are you feeling a lot of sympathy for Ricciardo in the way he's been treated? Because obviously you know Ricciardo well of old, not just from Formula One, but from his career before that.
Yeah, that's right. I first came across Daniel in British Formula 3. I covered his two quite controversial 2009 championship winning season. It wasn't controversial for anything he did, but he was up against a team that was employing a driver basically a little bit in the Stroll mould, actually a precursor to that, to help the team owner's son in the championship fight. And Ricciardo managed to kind of stave that off. And then that propelled him on to World Series and then eventually into Formula One. And then I came back, our paths crossed again in 2014. That was my first year covering Formula One. And obviously that was Daniel's breakout season as a top Formula One driver, where he got the better of Sebastian Vettel and won the first of his 8, I think it was in the end, Grand Prix victories. So yeah, I saw very much the best of him, I think, in F1. You know, he was genuinely among the very best drivers for at least 2 of those kind of early hybrid seasons, I would say. So it's kind of sad that curtain is closing finally. I think, you know, as Scott mentioned, performance-wise, you can't really argue it. This is kind of a bonus F1 career anyway. He was Lando Norris out of F1 at the end of 2022. He had the McLaren team photo and the send-off there. And then there's this kind of like, I might be able to get back to the front if all the dice fall in the right way and things go well at Red Bull. He was lucky to get in to the AlphaTauri RB seat because the Nick de Vries gamble failed. And, you know, he just hasn't been able to make the case convincing enough to take this all the way to the hoped for conclusion. Where I have sympathy for him is that he's effectively a victim of a kind of Red Bull power play, it seems, on the driver front. You know, the De Vries thing was very much a Marco play. Getting Ricciardo back in as a kind of bench warmer for Perez was a Horner play. And now it feels like this is more Marco having his way again. You know, he's been the big Liam Lawson fan, if you like. The whole RB team was meant to be going out on its own and becoming this kind of more separate entity with its identity in its own right, and not just a B team or a junior team. And now it seems like half a season in, they're flipping the whole strategy back to what it was before they turned it into the RB team. So the whole thing has been massively confusing, and I feel sympathy that Ricciardo's been caught up in that and doesn't get to go out of F1 on his own terms.
I think the way that it played out over the Singapore weekend has probably cost Red Bull quite dearly, not just in the court of public opinion, because there will obviously be a lot of people who do think, as Ben and I have both mentioned, ultimately it's the right decision performance-wise, whether it happened now or in 6 races' time or whatever, but the way it was handled. But also I think with Ricciardo himself, I think it's telling that the Red Bull announcement of it and also Ricciardo's recognition of his situation haven't made it clear that he is, staying in the Red Bull family, or that, he still has some kind of future, or, some kind of ambassador role long term, which is, I think there's a very good chance that Ricciardo is heading in that direction. We were talking just before we started recording, and Ben, you mentioned sort of something David Coulthard-esque. That felt like it was perfectly on the cards.
Yeah.
But he's out entirely. It's not a temporary separation to sort of see what happens over the next few races. Maybe Lawson struggles and Ricciardo comes back in next year. That's not going to happen. He's not staying within the Red Bull family. I'm sure he'll get the F1 equivalent of the sacked football manager. He'll always be welcome in Red Bull hospitality and that kind of thing. Yeah. But yeah, I think from the way that it emerged pre-Singapore weekends, it's pretty clear that Marco was talking to some people and indicating what he would like to happen, which was Ricciardo out and Lawson in. And the fact that nobody really sort of stood up for Ricciardo in that leadership. They were all, cowardly is probably the wrong word, but they were all very happy going on the record and speaking on TV and speaking to the media and saying that, it was open, it was that there could be a decision like this, but they didn't want to be emphatic about it. They also didn't want to stand up for Ricciardo and say, no, he's our driver for now. This isn't happening, blah, blah, blah. I don't think any of that has helped Red Bull. And I think that was shown in the fact that Ricciardo took control of his narrative through the weekend. And as I said, if he was going to, if a bridge hadn't been damaged, if not burned, I think the way it's been framed in the statements would be quite different.
Yeah, it's a really weird situation, isn't it? Because I actually quite like the way Ricciardo seized control of the narrative and given himself a farewell, because it definitely wasn't set, so he didn't know for sure, but he could definitely see which way the wind was blowing. And then you've ended up with this strange thing whereby they've announced Lawson in, but first they had thanks on social media to Daniel Ricciardo for everything he's done. So it's quite a weird way of doing things. I guess, Ben, it's not really the way he'd want to bow out of Formula One, but I imagine he'll be more dissatisfied by the fact that the performance has been a bit erratic ultimately. Yes, you'd like a nice send-off, but he'd have been far happier if he'd been performing at the top of his game. And we haven't seen the best of Ricciardo, any more than glimpses of it on a consistent basis. We haven't seen that since he left Renault.
No, that's right. The McLaren stint was galling. And there was always that question of, but the McLaren through that period is quite an idiosyncratic car itself. Lando Norris was... we've come to know how good Lando Norris is and potentially could be, but he'd grown up in that environment. Ricciardo very much had this view of, he doesn't know any better. He just knows McLaren and their way of doing a Formula One car. So extracting performance from it is kind of ingrained in him. Ricciardo was finding all this kind of weirdness, sending his own brain a bit haywire. He was having to unlearn habits, relearn new ones, deconstruct his driving. It's something you've explained before, Scott, but that sent him down the garden path effectively. And this whole Red Bull opportunity was kind of quite left field. I mean, I never saw it. I always thought, if he really wants to keep going in F1, he should probably take the Haas seat that Gunther Steiner at the time was kind of dangling, and then kind of rebuild it slowly. But this kind of Red Bull all or nothing thing, that was a kind of genius move. It was like, well, if he's got it, it really is just a McLaren anomaly and it's not Ricciardo. This will become the launch pad to get him back to where he should have been before he left for Renault, because ultimately, he could have been Max Verstappen's teammate for longer into the beginning of the Honda era, but chose to leave. And there's been the glimpses that the cameo at the end of last season when they dropped De Vries, obviously that got interrupted by the hand injury, so you didn't get quite the spread of races you wanted to make a full judgment, but we saw enough to think, well, he's not as bad as he was at McLaren. And he was doing things at that team, to bring the development on and get it a bit more coherent. So you felt, well, he's adding, if nothing else, that kind of properly experienced driver direction to the engineering group and what have you. And it was like, right, but 2024, we need to see the kick on. And unfortunately, the way Tsunoda started the season, and I think the fact that Red Bull has never been fully convinced about Tsunoda. We've talked him up at times, and he has been good, probably justified a shot in the second Red Bull seat if they're not convinced about Perez, but they won't do it. So Tsunoda's become this kind of permanent B team benchmark, and they're measuring everyone against him. And Ricciardo has done some okay things this year, but he's not been better than Tsunoda, certainly not emphatically. And so it leads you to the inevitable conclusion that, he would have been dropped at the end of this year, I think, under normal circumstances, and they would have tried something else, as it turns out, probably Lawson. But if they had another plan, maybe another driver. I think to drop him mid-season in the way they have, and this haphazard nature of communication around it, not good. But, that Ricciardo hasn't been able to recapture his best. So, as he put it, I think he's realised he didn't have a future with Red Bull ultimately. So what's the point? And also, everything's just kind of caught up with him. The game in Formula One moves on so quickly. If you don't move with it, you can get left behind. And I think he's started to realise that, younger drivers, probably cheaper drivers, better drivers have come in. And we're now talking about a guy who's probably not in the conversation among the top 14 or 15 on the grid. If you add in, people like Colapinto and Behrman, who've made a big splash in their early cameos for other teams on that grid.
The way that it's gone with this Red Bull kind of experiment, should we call it, kind of shows just how good a play it was, because even despite that interrupted cameo last year, despite only showing flashes of his best this year, and I still think the flashes we saw this year weren't quite the old Ricciardo as well, if you see what I mean. So like when we have seen him at his best, it still wasn't quite 2014, 2016, 2020 Ricciardo necessarily in those moments. Yeah. Even despite that, he still came really close to nicking Perez's seat, because Perez was like in the weirdest way, Perez upheld his end of the bargain. Perez was so bad that Red Bull was willing to drop him.
But they gave him the contract. That's the thing I don't understand. They give Perez the contract, and then he goes terrible, and then they just keep sticking with him. But
you never know what the clauses are in a contract. It might well be that the contract Perez signed at the start of this year was more favourable from Red Bull's perspective in terms of being able to jettison him. But my point is that when Ricciardo mapped out this return, Red Bull third driver, be a show pony for a few months, wait and wait and wait. That didn't come with a guarantee that they would definitely flick De Vries after a few months, let alone flick Perez at some point. But he was able to get back on the grid. He was able to show that he's not as bad as he was at McLaren. And he had an underperforming driver in the second Red Bull that gave him an opportunity to nick that dream return that he was aching for. It so nearly paid off, but he came up short. And he admits that. And what I respect about the whole thing, while still acknowledging the fact that he has ultimately not quite delivered and he's not quite as good as he used to be, and it's kind of okay that he's falling off the grid, I respect that he was willing to give it a go, that he was willing to come back in a midfield car when I don't think every driver would do that. He didn't want to do it in any old circumstance, which is why he wouldn't take the Haas drive. He didn't want to be in F1 for the sake of it. It was all about, can I get back to the front. So he gave it a go. I respect him for that. And I also massively respect him for holding his hands up and saying, look, I'm not quite good enough. I haven't quite done it.
And it's answered any questions he'll have had in his mind as well. Okay, he'd have liked to carry on for a bit. But I think had it ended at McLaren, there'd have always been that, is it McLaren that was the problem or me? I think in the RB seasons, sort of two-part seasons as it were, he's got the answer that actually I wasn't quite there, even though at the absolute best of his performances, he was pretty good. So I actually think from that perspective, it's a reasonable end. I think it's a much better end than the previous one he had ultimately. And yeah, he had a chance. He gave it a very, very good go. It was funny though. I asked him on Thursday in Singapore when he was very on message, because as he understood it, there wasn't any threat for the rest of the season. He had a pretty good idea that Lawson was going to take his seat next year, I think. So I think he knew he was winding down. But I said to him, have you almost made it difficult for Red Bull because your performances are a bit in the middle, in that you're not, you're good enough to maybe be considered for Red Bull Racing. You're good enough to stay in RB, but you're also not good enough not to be dropped out of hand. And he said, well, I don't really like being there. But yeah, and I think that's kind of where it ended up. He's not been bad. He's just not been massively good. He's been, a sort of, like you said, he's down in that sort of 14th, 15th best driver on the grid, maybe.
I always felt there was this danger at the start of the season that him and Tsunoda would cancel each other out, because if Tsunoda beat Ricciardo, but not absolutely emphatically, or even emphatically, people would just say, but Daniel Ricciardo is washed up since his McLaren stint, so that's no great shakes. But for Ricciardo, because of the doubts around Tsunoda, he could not afford to get to a point where Tsunoda's overall, even if there's been a few good races here or there, overall be behind him. And, when you balance it out, Tsunoda's been the better RB driver, I think. Not emphatically, but at least marginally. And that's just not enough. That's not enough for Red Bull to say, yeah, you've got what we thought we saw on the sim and in that test you did at Silverstone. And for Ricciardo also to say, yeah, I'm back, baby. I can do it. I can go all the way to the top again. Yeah,
very much so. And yeah, Ricciardo started poorly, got back on top of things, had some weekends where he's stronger than Tsunoda. So yeah, he can leave with his head held high, and he leaves with a lot of respect in the paddock. He's very, very well liked, and he got another chance. So I don't think in the grand scheme of things it's too bad, even though it's ended a bit weirdly.
Get your football scores in a snap with the Apple Sports app. The free app for iPhone gives you access to real-time football scores, a dynamic drive tracker, and live play-by-play, all delivered ultra-fast. Plus, get team and player stats, standings, live betting odds, and more. Designed for speed and simplicity, the Apple Sports app is personalized and puts your favorite leagues, conferences, and teams front and center. Download Apple Sports now in the App Store in the US, Canada, and the UK.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right. You could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on, or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn, and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
Right, let's move on to Liam Lawson now, Scott. He's confirmed for the next 6 races at RB, so that's set. Nothing mentioned about 2025. So is this just a warm-up for his full season with the team next year, or could there be a bigger prize on offer?
Well, if it was just a warm-up, I think we'd know that he was going to be a 2025 RB driver. I think it's as simple as that. There is no reason not to announce him for that now, unless he's so unconvincing in the 2022 car tests that he's done and whatever tyre test work he's done, that they've suddenly changed their mind on him as an RB driver entirely, and now he's only got 6 races to prove himself before Helmut Marko decides that they need to pay a load of money to get Franco Colapinto in the RB next season off of Williams, or Isaac Hadjar has a super end to F2 and wins. There are a few little doubts about Hadjar at the moment in terms of his ultimate potential. Lawson is not just at the front of the queue. It's a very, very short queue. And he's not...
He is the queue.
Yeah, pretty much. So the only logical answer, which is a sort of my process of coming to this conclusion, has genuinely taken place over 2 or 3 days from when I first started thinking about it. So now I'm just utterly convinced. Like, nothing anyone at Red Bull can say would change my mind that this is nothing but a 6-race audition for a Red Bull Racing Drive next year. It's the only thing that makes sense.
And it's well deserved for Lawson to be in, because he did a great job in that 5-weekend outing last year. Obviously came in on the Saturday at Zandvoort, got those points in Singapore. So yeah, he in a way kind of did the Colapinto thing in that he wasn't a shoo-in to get an F1 Red Bull seat at any point, but he dropped in as a reserve, did a really good job across those 5 races, and then it kind of became a question of when rather than if he would get a full-time seat. So we shouldn't lose sight of the fact this is just a nice, well-deserved chance for Lawson, isn't it, Ben? He can really show that what he did in that 5-race outing was kind of just a baseline to build from, and there's a lot more to come for him.
Yeah, there was a scenario towards the end of last year where I felt like, well, actually throughout this, it's felt like Red Bull has been looking for an excuse to drop Perez and just hasn't quite been able to push go on it. And
we know Marco's been pushing Lawson in at RB for a long time this season. Remember those rumours early in the season after 3-4 races? They didn't come from nowhere. It was Marco driving that.
Yeah, and it's not been coherent for a while. And Perez was right on the bubble. And then it felt like because they got the Constructors' Championship last year, as well as Max's cakewalk of a Drivers' Championship, and there was a glimmer of improvement towards the end, they kind of went, oh yeah, let's just stick, let's not go for the Hastly move of binning Perez now. Let's stick with him. And then we've got Ricciardo kind of lined up in the background just in case, and that might spur Perez on because he knows there's somebody lurking. They could have put Lawson in the RB for this season from the start, but then they felt like, we need the experienced driver maybe, and it's better to have that blend of youth and experience while we get that team to sort itself out. So Lawson's always been kind of pushing a bit. And I think you're right. He surprised everyone within that organisation how well he did with his kind of cameo replacing Ricciardo. And there was always this kind of background knowledge that they needed to sort him a seat for 2025 by around this time of 2024. They didn't need to do this thing they're doing now, which is put him in the car for the final 6 races of the season. So as Scott says, it can only be, given they haven't confirmed he's in for next season alongside Tsunoda, they're looking again for another way to lever Perez out, because they know what Lawson can do, just like they know what Ricciardo can do. So there's no benefit really in changing the drivers now, unless you're looking again with Tsunoda as this kind of benchmark that's not going anywhere. Can Lawson find an extra gear over the next 6 races to show, yes, emphatically he can achieve this level of performance that Ricciardo hasn't been able to, that is enough for Red Bull to go, right, if we plug this guy in alongside Max instead of Perez, that will give us an uplift in what is becoming, a much more difficult than they anticipated fight at the front of F1.
The thing is, with the way that it's going, there is always an argument for, if this is the change they're going to make for next year, just get on with it. And some people were making that case, and I don't disagree with that. Ultimately, like fundamentally, I think that is in principle perfectly valid, but it didn't, if that's your only reason for doing it, it didn't feel worth the way that they were going about it. Only doing it for 6 races at the end of the year, doing it for starters on a sprint weekend at a track that Lawson doesn't know, because that was the race that Ricciardo
That's very
back.
Marco though, isn't it?
Yeah, well,
but drop him
even
in.
Maybe, but that's why I think it's bigger picture, because I don't think you do that if the ambition is limited to, can we get RB 6th place in the championship over the line? You don't. This is actually, I think, short term, arguably a worse play.
Yeah, potentially.
So it doesn't quite. So it doesn't quite make sense there, and also the fact that that you are pointlessly, embarrassing Ricciardo, not giving him the send-off he deserves. There's basically no harm in just letting Ricciardo see out the season. This wasn't a Logan Sargent Williams situation where the driver is just woefully underperforming and is not going to get to the level or be at the level that they need to be, which again just comes back to the point of it has to be something else. There has to be a bigger play here. And what is so Red Bull of old, is a 6-race audition to get yourself in the top team for next year in tricky circumstances, in a way where you can properly announce yourself when they're looking at you with that specific target in mind, because he didn't have that when he did his cameo last year. It wasn't that kind of pressured environment. This is a lot more Red Bull of old.
I think it also shows that perhaps there's a nagging lack of faith even in Lawson's ability, that they haven't seen enough or they don't know enough to think, yeah, actually, if we decide to can Perez at the end of this season, he's a lock. It feels like they need to see something else. And that then just speaks to this whole wider picture of them just not, I mean, you mentioned it, Scott, the queue is very short. They just don't have enough options. They've got one outstanding driver and then just a bunch of kind of middling drivers that they're not convinced about. I feel like from the way Horner was talking during the Singapore weekend, the kid that they're most enthused about, or at least he is, we don't know about Marco because they weren't doing a co-interview, is Lindblad, Arvin Lindblad in Formula 3, but he's at least another season away from qualifying enough super license points to be on the grid. So they've got, again, one of these gaps to fill, a kind of holding pattern until they can kind of maybe find a new star and plug him into play.
As I've said a few times before, it's just massive strategic mismanagement. They've got everything they need to be in the best possible position in terms of their driver lineup, and they've generally ticked the most difficult box, which is who's your lead driver. Your Verstappen, your Ricciardo, your Vettel. Have sort of been the 3 Red Bull leaders while they've been a winning team. That's fine, but the other 3 seats have been all over the shop, and it's just astounds me that the team that has had so much success, Red Bull, has been incredibly effective in Formula 1, just leaves this all to chance. And I guess the big question is Lawson good enough to be the solution to the Red Bull racing problem? Now, I'm kind of open on that. He might be a decent number 2 for Red Bull Racing. I'm not completely convinced. He's also a driver who historically has tended to start championships very well and get to his level pretty quickly and then not quite take that last step. He's very good and certainly worthy of Formula 1, RB seat, fine. But yeah, that's... It feels like they're hoping he might suddenly be brilliant for 6 races and be the answer, but it doesn't feel like a satisfactory answer. I could be wrong on that. I'm still willing to be persuaded, but that's kind of where I see it at the moment.
Well, the thing is, where Lawson's historically been strong is when he's had the least expectation on him, and he's thrived in these slightly weird career scenarios. When he got dropped in the DTM and beat Alex Albon in the DTM. He should have been champion that year, if you remember that really controversial finale where I think one of the rival manufacturers' other cars took him out and let their teammate win effectively. And then he was kind of all right in F2, but then he went to Super Formula and really did that thing that is really difficult to do, which is go out to Super Formula and basically nail it as a rookie. Came in, dumped in the deep end in F1 last season, did a really good job. I actually think he will therefore do a really good job in this cameo as well. And if I extend that logic further, maybe that's what makes him a really good Red Bull pick, because there's nothing more deep-endy in Formula 1 than being dumped in alongside Max Verstappen at a team. But the flip side to that is, if that then becomes the expectation and the full programme, does that then go back to when he has been good but not spectacular? It's tricky. It's tricky to know which side of the equation it sort of comes out on. If there was
proper strategy behind this, and
you
idiot, get shut up, Ben.
He's just it's a random driver generator. You know that.
You can every time you try and talk now, I'm just going to talk over you. You absolute moron.
Well, in a bizarro universe where there's proper strategy behind these decisions,
in the darkest Red Bull timeline where they actually have a strategy,
they would have thought about these things you just mentioned. You know, Lawson's ability to drop in somewhere and surprise people, multiple occasions. You'd think, right, well, he's just done that at the end of 2023. So if we think he's got the potential to be a really good Max Verstappen teammate, better than the one we've got now, surely you would blood him in, your junior team, even if you're going to pretend that your junior team's not going to really be your junior team anymore, through the whole of 2024. You wouldn't make him the reserve driver, bench him, and then just wait until now to go, oh, right, yeah, now actually we want to give you some races in F1 again in the junior team, because maybe you might get promoted to the A team next season. It just feels like a very recent thing. You know, Scott, you mentioned before how close Perez came in season to being binned, and they pulled back. It's felt like the whole year the focus had been on Perez, and it's gone away because of the good start, and he got the contract, and it's come back again. And by the summer break, it was like it's teetering on the brink of just being done. And Ricciardo gets in, and then, you know, Lawson just makes the automatic substitution. And now suddenly it's completely flipped around, and Perez is suddenly looking much more secure. And then all of a sudden, Ricciardo, yeah, okay, he was always in a slightly weird position. He's just done like that. And now it's like Lawson's in, but he's not in because Ricciardo's been awful and they're just trying to get a head start on the 2025 RB lineup. He's in because they're now thinking again that he might be the guy to replace Perez. But if it was strategic, they would know that already. They know Lawson well enough to know that whether or not he has the potential to be better than Perez in the second Red Bull. It just feels to me like a desperate play, because they're suddenly much, much, much more under pressure in the constructors' race, which we always said the day would come where Perez's underperformance would let them down in the championship, and it's come probably sooner than they or we expected, but nevertheless it's come, and they haven't planned for it.
No, it's a bunch of problems coming home to roost at the same time, effectively. It's why you're now hearing Christian Horner make noises about George Russell and his availability for 2026, which isn't something that Red Bull need to be relying upon. I do think that is more in the context of as a potential plan B for Verstappen than it is about a teammate for Verstappen, but the point still stands. So yeah, it's just a signal of the chaos. Basically, they can't see beyond the tip of the RB20's nose, basically, in terms of what they're doing. And it has changed on a race-by-race basis this year. It's been incredibly volatile. Ricciardo admitted it in Singapore that he's basically been under evaluation weekend in, weekend out. It's been so short-term, everything that they've done. And they're being found out for it now. And I think Ricciardo De Vries was a victim of that. He was a beneficiary of it and then a victim of it. Like exactly the same for Ricciardo, beneficiary and victim. Lawson's got to be hoping that the same pattern isn't repeated, because he's a beneficiary now, but it could be him in 12 months' time that is having a difficult moment in his F1 career, short F1 career though it will be, and then maybe he finds himself in a Pierre Gasly, Alex Albon situation, promoted far too soon, and then he wilts, because what else is a young driver who's good but not great meant to do in that kind of scenario?
I think the positive thing is, aside from all the weirdness of what's going on at Red Bull, I think Lawson has earned this opportunity, certainly to get into an RB. I really like what he did last year. So I think it's good from that perspective. It's a driver who's, shown in that difficult chance he had with AlphaTauri. I forgot what it was called last year. With AlphaTauri last year. I think it's good that
Toro Rosso, Edd Minardi.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's good that he's getting back on the grid, and I just got no idea how it's going to go. It's such a strange scenario to be in for him, but good luck to him.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right. You could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on, or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit card.
Right, for the final part, we've got a few questions from the Race Members Club related to this. We got these after the Singapore Grand Prix when it was a bit difficult to tackle them entirely because we kind of knew what was happening, but it hadn't actually properly happened because all of this stuff did actually get finally decided in the past couple of days. So although there were indicators of what was going to happen. It was not set. So, a few questions. Scott, one from Chad S. RB is, at least substantially, a vehicle to sell energy drinks and to promote a credit card company, as evidenced by its ponderous team name. Ruthlessly dropping a popular figure like Ricciardo would not seem to be the best way to present either corporate brand in a positive light. How much are such decisions made based on competitiveness on track versus sponsors' competitiveness in the marketplace?
Before I answer the question, Ed, can you confirm that Chad's original question definitely referred to it being evidenced by its ponderous team name, or did you add that in maliciously afterwards?
No, that was included. That's why it's qualified. Any criticism, avert or implied, of the team name, I absolutely endorse, and that boosts your chance of getting a question answered on the podcast, as long as it is at least tangentially related to the team.
I would take this opportunity at the moment, and this might be news to Ben, to urge everybody listening to go on the RB Formula One team's Wikipedia page and read the section about the team rebrand and the incredible Edd Straw reference. I wouldn't even say reference, really, citing of Edd Straw that crops up in this. I'm so happy that I have been alerted to that, because it genuinely made my day. Made my day when I found it.
I found it.
I'd like to stress, I didn't put it in. It was flagged up to me, and I was amused.
Shall I read it out?
It's absolutely. I'm not gonna. No. I want people to find it on their own. And if you do take my advice and find it, tag me and Ed on Twitter and let me know what you think of it, because it's genuinely. I'd love to know what you think. Anyway, back to Chad's question. It isn't a binary thing. It isn't only sporting sort of considerations that go into such decisions. You would like to think it would be, because that's kind of the main purpose, but the other elements do feed in. When it comes to dropping Ricciardo now, obviously that is overwhelmingly done on the sporting side, and actually I would say this is entirely done for what we can loosely term sporting reasons. I think obviously like Red Bull's inherent self-inflicted driver crisis is within that, because it falls within a sporting remit. But this is the worst possible commercial decision that Red Bull could have made driver-wise, which I think shows why they've made it. Because it's not just they're not letting him do Austin, which is his favourite race and a massive race for the American sponsors that are involved. But he's then not doing Mexico, which is another big market and a place that he actually has a really good track record at. And he's not doing Vegas as well, which is the single biggest event of the season for their sponsors, where RB, backed by their massive new sponsors for their silly team name, held their launch that nobody could watch or attend at the start of the year. So if you were doing it purely for commercial reasons, like this would be very possibly one of the single worst decisions an F1 team has ever made. And with some of the decisions around this team, you wouldn't rule it out, but it's clearly not being done for those reasons, because you just would not take away your massive marketing asset away from these races that are coming up. It's I would say half of the races between now and the end of the year are enormous opportunities for those brands. And they don't have Ricciardo now to cash in with that. So it hasn't been done commercially. As I understand it, they tried to make it a commercial decision, and that there was some pushback from that side. That's my reading of the situation. But ultimately, they've acted in what they think is the best interest of the team, or the teams, plural.
Yeah, and it did confuse some of the backers as well in terms of what was going on, because obviously they saw all the stories. So there was that element as well, in that they were slightly puzzled by it. So yeah, it wasn't great, I would say, just the general way it played out for MasterCard, Venmo, RB, or whatever they're called. I lose track. Ben, a question for you from Adam Barton. How expensive will it be financially for RB to drop Daniel Ricciardo mid-season?
Well, as Scott quite perfectly outlined, commercial considerations have not been at the forefront of this decision quite clearly. So if they had to waste another few million on getting rid of him, why not? I think it shows you that despite protestations to the contrary, and that team supposedly being more independent, the tail doesn't wag the dog, does it? They can, like Franz Tost used to do, they can nominally voice opposition, but they have no power when it comes to the ultimate decisions. This would not be, I imagine, anything like the McLaren situation where Ricciardo had another year locked in under contract and they had to negotiate an exit and pay him off effectively. So he's done quite well probably out of this stint, because he was paid to sit out 2023 but got nevertheless a Red Bull reserve deal as part of that. So he was on kind of double salary for last season, and then obviously he got a 1-year RB seat for this season, but obviously with clauses and performance reviews and what have you. So I imagine effectively, if it's quarterly, they're not going to pay the final, or they're going to have to pay him probably the final quarter that's due. So he, if it's nominally 8 million for the year, say he gets 2, and then the contract's done and dusted, and off you go. So I imagine there's a small financial penalty for Red Bull, but nothing massive in the grand scheme of things.
I believe that he had an option for next year on Red Bull's side, but it wasn't like McLaren where he had a third year of the contract that was, cast iron. So my suspicion is Red Bull has every right to not continue with him for next year. And then, as you said there, Ben, it will just be a case of paying what he's owed for the rest of this year, unless, of course, they had a very, very favourable Red Bull agreement, because we know that Red Bull loves to jettison drivers that are underperforming. So you never know. With the fact that it was they had all the leverage, didn't they, when they did that deal? Maybe they did it as a whatever the F1 equivalent is of pay as you play. But I doubt it. I suspect he will be owed a little something for his troubles for the rest of this year.
Yeah, a guy who's done as well as he has and won multiple Grand Prix and what have you is unlikely to accept a contract where you're on a quarterly review or a monthly review or a race by race review. I can't rule it out, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
I imagine it was a classic 1+1, and it was like 24 is guaranteed, and then we'll see what happens about 25.
Well, I think he had a 1+1+1 when he came back in, because as I understand it, when he was the third driver in 23, the RB chance, or the AlphaTauri chance as it was at the time, and then getting the seat for the following year, and then what they might want to do for him for 25, it was all connected. And then my guess is they were just fettling the exact details of it depending on what kind of Red Bull contract he had. So yeah, they've been in a good position. I'm sure he's got a lot out of it. Financially, it won't be an issue. Ricciardo, as I understand it, Ricciardo doesn't have a massive issue with the way this has played out in terms of the outcome, which will be financially, and in terms of whether he loses the drive, he accepts where he is, whatever. It's the way they handled it in terms of the communication around it and that final weekend that I think has had a little bit more of a negative impact.
And I suspect when it came to any negotiations, it's probably fairly easy, because it's just kind of, well, we'll pay you to the end of the year. You don't have to turn up and be a reserve driver or anything. It's just kind of one of those sort of things that's quietly running its course. The last question is from Lachlan Babbage that I'll take. If this was Daniel Ricciardo's last race in F1, and that question was sent after the Singapore Grand Prix, and of course it does appear Singapore will be, I can't see any chance of Ricciardo wanting to, or getting a drive elsewhere anyway, as we've discussed. How do you think his career will be remembered? I'll give a very short answer to this, because we're going to do a full podcast really looking at Daniel Ricciardo's career. But I think once the career ends, you can look at it as a whole. A lot of the discourse in the past few years that we've done has been about the immediate, the McLaren struggles, the RB struggles, the situation. Can he get into Red Bull? Will he get dropped, etc., etc.? But I think that once the dust settles and you take that step back, it's been a really impressive Formula One career. Really impressive. One I would argue merited probably more than 8 victories. He obviously had his pomp in a Red Bull team that was not at its best in that time. There were only occasional victories on the table. He drove some great races, not just some of the wins, but to second, third, fourth places. Really, really fine performer. I had him as the number one F1 performer of 2014. When I was at Autosport. Ben, you did the same for him in 2016. Really, really impressive. I think he was a driver who, had he had a shot at the World Championship in the right moment with the right car, could easily have done it, a kind of Jenson Button style, that sort of number 1.5 level, because there's not many gold standard, stunning drivers. When things were right, he was incredibly, incredibly good. And I'd have liked to have seen him have a proper run at the championship. So he's in that group of ones who could have maybe done that, because he never quite got into that absolute top car. I think what's happened more recently has shown there was perhaps a limitation in adaptability. There was maybe a little bit of a limitation in terms of his technical ability. That confused him a little bit when at McLaren. But that's what happens. There's always little limitations here and there. The very, very best, the absolute gold standard drivers, they're infinitely adaptable. They thrive in almost all circumstances. So that's where I see Ricciardo, and I just want to applaud what he's done, because I think he's been a fantastic Grand Prix driver. I don't remotely agree with some of these revisionist things. It's just, he's been found out in recent years. No, because a big chunk of his Grand Prix career, in fact, the majority, and that includes the 2 Renault years where he performed really well in machinery that wasn't winning machinery, he has been incredibly good. And it's just a little bit of a shame that it ends with the 2 difficult McLaren years and then the 2 bits and pieces RB years. That's how I see it anyway.
Well, all political careers end in failure, don't they, Ed? And it would appear all F1 careers end in failure too.
Well, it's very, very rare that you get to go out on your own terms in Formula One, isn't it? Very, very few drivers manage that. Few have the opportunity, fewer still get it right.
I guess the only thing I would add to all of this, kind of touched on it earlier. When we were recording video around this, which presumably by the time people listen to this might be visible on the race's YouTube channel. We finished recording that, and I was going to give him his actual job title then, but I just think like our all things to all things video, Luke Hinsel kind of said that it was like people stood around a casket, the way that we were kind of talking about Ricciardo towards the end of it. And I'd said, like, well, career-wise it is, isn't it? Like, this is basically the morning phase of a great F1 career. And I think part of the reason Luke kind of made that remark and why it came across that way is because, we talked a little bit about him as the kind of person and character as well. And the only other thing I'd like to add on this podcast on it, because there'll be another time to reflect on him as a driver and his career, is I just have as I mentioned earlier, I just have a huge amount of respect for the way he went about things. And not a lot of drivers handle difficult moments with grace, and they deal with scrutiny and speculation very, very poorly sometimes. I cannot remember a single moment in the last 4 years where Ricciardo lashed out at any of that, at hard lines of questionings, what he might have considered to be unfair lines of questionings. He's always held a mirror up to himself, like pretty much constantly through the McLaren time and the Red Bull time now. And like I said, from my understanding, I don't even think he massively argues with this decision. He kind of just accepts it and goes, I didn't do quite as good a job as I wanted to. And I do think that deserves recognition. It doesn't excuse the fact that he's not as good as he used to be. It doesn't make up for anything like that. It's just, he's got this reputation as a joker, someone smiling all the time. He's super popular, blah, blah, blah. I think the grid and the paddock will be a poorer place just for losing someone of that caliber that can still talk about themselves in that light, because that kind of humility and kind of self-criticism is quite rare in the top performers, and it probably does reflect his fall from his peak a little bit as well. But yeah, I'll miss seeing him around and having him around, because I do think he was a genuinely good addition to the paddock off track, even if on track his star had waned a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd 100% endorse that. But as always, Formula One will go on. It'll carry on. He'll be not forgotten, but Formula One moves on very, very quickly. And you feel like these big characters will leave a massive hole, but others come in to fill the hole. Liam Lawson's job is to do that. And it's now his time to see what he can do in Formula One. So well done, Daniel Ricciardo. Good luck to Liam Lawson. And thanks very much to Scott and Ben for leaping on for this news reaction podcast. Still a few weeks to go till the next race, but we're going to keep on talking. So stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.
Get your football scores in a snap with the Apple Sports app. The free app for iPhone gives you access to real-time football scores, a dynamic drive tracker, and live play-by-play, all delivered ultra-fast. Plus, get team and player stats, standings, live betting odds, and more. Designed for speed and simplicity, the Apple Sports app is personalized and puts your favorite leagues, conferences, and teams front and center. Download Apple Sports now in the App Store in the US, Canada, and the UK. Get your football scores in a snap with the Apple Sports app. The free app for iPhone gives you access to real-time football scores, a dynamic drive tracker, and live play-by-play, all delivered ultra-fast. Plus, get team and player stats, standings, live betting odds, and more. Designed for speed and simplicity, the Apple Sports app is personalized and puts your favorite leagues, conferences, and teams front and center. Download Apple Sports now in the App Store in the US, Canada, and the UK.